lot of people keep saying like we need to make the world better for our children or for like the next generation. But I agree that there's like something not right about that. We also have this one life to live. We have this one life to prosper, and we can't keep living that life under oppression or under authoritarianism. Like we're also trying to make the world better for us, not just for future generations to come. And I hope a lot of people will live by that ethos for the next 4 years.
When I set out on putting together this series on how to not lose hope under Trump 2.0, I knew this was not going to be an easy task. And to be frank with you, today's episode is the hardest of this series. In just his first day in office, President Donald Trump signed a number of executive orders that threaten American democracy and are already being challenged in the courts. And how could we forget Trump's promise of being a dictator only on day one? With the system of checks and balances in question and the Democratic Party still trying to get back on its feet, in what state is American democracy left? From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. Today on the show, how to not lose hope on American democracy under Trump 2.0. On what is the most difficult episode of this series, on how to not lose hope under Trump 2.0, I'm lucky to be joined by Greta Bedekovics. Greta is the Associate Director of Democracy Policy at the Center for American Progress, an independent, nonpartisan policy institute based in Washington. Before joining American Progress, Greta worked on the U.S. Senate as a policy advisor on voting rights and election security. I spoke with Greta the day after Trump's inauguration, and the mood in D.C. was still somber. But I promise that there's light at the end of the tunnel for American democracy. Here's my conversation with Greta Bedekovics.
So we're talking just one day after Trump was inaugurated again as president of the United States. Greta, you were in DC, you were just 20 minutes from Capitol Hill. Tell us, how was the mood like yesterday?
I think it was a very somber mood. The majority of DC's makeup is quite progressive, quite liberal, especially, for folks born here, even though it's not a state. So I think every time, unfortunately, a conservative president takes office, there's kind of a sad mood. And I think a lot of times DC is particularly affected by it too, because Congress can actually make laws for DC, the way that our government works. So I think a lot of people have fear because of that alone, how, this presidency might affect DC in of itself. But I think, when you just feel that there's all these people who are extremists or far right kind of descending on DC to either go to the inauguration or go to these events, it kind of feels sometimes like your city's being taken over in this like very temporary space. So I know me and a bunch of my friends were like, we're not leaving the house yesterday. And that's kind of what we all did. So a lot of the streets were empty. You just kind of heard helicopters flying around all day. Then 20 years ago, regardless of the president, it would have been a very big event. Everybody would have been out in the streets. I mean, I even remember when President Biden won the election when it was called, I think 4 or 5 days after election day. Everybody in the streets just left their apartment buildings. Like everybody just went into the streets, just walked to the White House. There's kind of a huge party, and it was just such a good feeling to know that everybody had the exact same idea to kind of congregate in front of the White House and to celebrate it. And even when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I lived a couple blocks from the Supreme Court, and it was just kind of this like feeling in you that you should be at the Supreme Court. And it was amazing to see that so many other people in DC had that same feeling. And so I think there's such a camaraderie in the city usually, and that obviously was just very absent yesterday.
And speaking of some of the people that were actually in attendance, I believe it was the first time that tech moguls, we speak of Elon Musk, of course you wouldn't miss the inauguration, but also Mark Zuckerberg, they were present. What does that speak to you, that there's this interconnection of policy and politics and such powerful people in the tech universe?
I think it's very concerning because, when you see there's kind of 4 or 5 main people, and so all this power is extremely concentrated. But if you saw photos too, I mean, they were in front of cabinet secretary picks. Like, they were the front line at the inauguration. They had the best seats. And so I think that sends a real signal for what this administration is going to look like and what they're going to prioritize. And, when you think about the fact that so much of our information throws through very few of these systems, I mean, Jeff Bezos also owns the Washington Post. There's already been some issues there with freedom of the press. I think it's just going to be very concerning to see how truth is heard for the next 4 years, where people are getting their information from. And I think even, traditional sources that people have trusted for media independence are going to kind of come under questioning. So I think it's going to be a very, very few tough years.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because the whole point of this series is how to not lose hope under Trump. And I've said it before we start recording, but I'll say it again, that I think this is the toughest episode of the series on how to not lose hope on democracy. So I also want to say thank you for agreeing to join this episode and tackle this topic. Let's talk about a bit about policy. The headline of yesterday was that Trump was going to sign close to 100 executive orders. I believe the final number did not reach 100, but still very significant. He also made headlines way before by saying that he would be dictator only on day one of his presidency. Well, nonetheless, I know you had a busy night reading up on the executive orders of President Donald Trump. Which of these executive orders that is signed startled you the most?
I think the one that startled me the most is the one about birthright citizenship. So essentially, he wants to attack the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was ratified after the Civil War here, so in the 1860s. And it really was, a core amendment that came out of the Civil War for us here in the United States that really says that anybody born in the United States is a citizen regardless of, their parents' immigration status. And that, I think, is something very unique to American democracy. I think that sets, American statehood apart from a lot of other countries, including Europe. But now they really want to attack that and basically say that people born in the United States, if their parents were undocumented or illegal immigrants, if they're not citizens themselves, are able to revoke their citizenship. So these are, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have lived their entire lives being American citizens, all of a sudden living under the possibility of ripping that away. And that is such a dangerous slope, because if you can do that to them, you can theoretically do it to anybody. And if, the idea of citizenship, a core tenet of any democracy, is dissolved like that, that's incredibly fearful. And I think just such a declining sign of where democracy stands. There were also some executive orders on AI policy, some calling for immigration raids, some declaring national emergency for drilling. And so, I think a lot of the campaign promises, unfortunately, that he made about the environment, the Paris Climate Accord, the United States has stepped out of, the World Health Organization, the United States has stepped out of. So I think it's a very clear sign of America kind of withdrawing from this international space as well, which was clear under the first administration. And some of these can be undone. Another president could sign executive orders stepping back into those. But I think it also shakes America's stability and in the international sphere if it's just in and out of this agreement, in and out of this agreement. Same way with some of the NATO policies that happened in a few years. But I think out of all the ones I saw yesterday, the birthright citizenship is definitely the one that kept me up at night.
There's a lot to unpack there, but as you were going over some of these threats to democracy, if we just want to put it on an umbrella, let's call it that, threats to democracy, because that's what they are. What stands out to me is that the United States is walking on a path of becoming increasingly isolated in the international arena. But how likely do you see all these steps that it took to actually come to fruition? There's, at the end of the day, the president has tremendous power in the United States, but is not alone in the arena. So of all of these threats, which ones do you see that can actually come to fruition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think something American democracy prides itself on is the system of checks and balances. So if everything's, operating in a healthy manner, you have the executive office, the president, but you have Congress to be a check on that. You also have the Supreme Court to be an equal check on that. But I think we've seen that that balance of power in many ways no longer exists. I think it's also particularly dangerous time because, Republican holds the presidency, Republicans hold both chambers of Congress, not by a super overwhelming majority, but obviously it gives a lot of the green light ahead to enact the types of policies that they want to do without limited pushback from Congress. At the same time, the Supreme Court is composed of many Trump-appointed judges who are obviously handpicked for a reason. I mean, he said he was basically going to overturn Roe versus Wade and or take away abortion rights in the United States. He said he was going to appoint Supreme Court justices to do exactly that, and that came to fruition. I think many people thought that that would never happen here, and yet it did in relatively short few years. So I think that's one point to look back on how these threats are not empty and they can become a reality. But I think when you put that whole picture together, to me, it feels like the court is not going to be a check on his authority. It feels like Congress is not going to be a check on his authority. And we've seen that a lot of times he would rather butt heads with international leaders than work with them, regardless of what issue is on. And that there are very few people who can be, words of wisdom regardless of their intentions. And I think we've seen that even in people who he's picked as cabinet secretaries or advisors in the White House, they are not people who are going to push back. They are people who are going to fall in line. They are people who are going to take orders regardless. I mean, one of the things that he's also said is the firing of military generals will be a top priority. And there's already been, or there's going to be, executive committee to review, five-star military generals as backgrounds and their years of service, which is kind of feels like just a fake scheme to fire them or let them go. And so when you have the military on your side that way as well, kind of taking commands without question, without expertise, that's also incredibly dangerous. And so I think you see that the traditional structures of power with checks and balances have kind of fallen apart or been very heavily swayed, and that there's also not people around him or around the White House or executive agencies who are going to be sources of pushback either.
And where does that leave the Democratic Party in this next 4 years? Is it the time for the party to maybe take a step back, reevaluate, choose its next leader, and, pick itself up from the massive defeats that it just suffered?
I think that's exactly right. I think there's a lot of reevaluation to do and looking itself in the mirror for the Democratic Party. I think if you ask me personally, I believe that it's not so much the policies here that people are opposed to that Democrats are pushing, but some of the messaging and the ways that they're trying to have those policies appeal to people. I mean, the Republican Party is very, very good at messaging and meeting people where they're at. There was, tons of candidates who went on podcasts, for example, to appeal to young white men because those are the things that they're listening to or on YouTube. And so I think Democrats have a lot of lessons to learn there about how to actually reach voters where they're at and be on those sources. But I think there's also a lack of young leaders, and that's a thing for both political parties. I mean, if you look at President Biden and President Trump, I mean they're almost 80 years old are 80 years and older. And so I think Americans are really craving a young presidency. That's a fact, and it's been proven multiple times that how much people rally behind younger candidates. But it's going to be hard to identify those sources of power and who can kind of be that next leader. And I think it's going to take a really strong personality in order to convince Americans to kind of turn the tide back on this. But I think the midterms will be a very good example or kind of the proof point if Democrats are able to turn things back around. And I think it's a little bit difficult because midterms they always favor the party that's not in power because people are always kind of going to be dissatisfied with how governing is happening. So I think you'll inevitably have that, but I'm hoping to see, a big swing back. In 2018, that's the year they called the blue wave. Again, under the Trump presidency, when Democrats really had a chance to push back and win back a lot of swing districts, a lot of red districts, and that came to reality. That happened. They were able to gain back a lot of control of Congress. And so I think we'll see if 2026 presents a similar opportunity.
Before joining American Progress, you worked on Capitol Hill as a policy advisor, and you worked on things such as voting rights, election security, and democracy legislation. The whole concept of this series is also that how much damage can be done in just 4 years of Donald Trump. I know a lot, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a system and an architecture that has been building up for centuries now. Do you remain hopeful in the robustness of American democratic institutions to survive under Donald Trump?
I think they're definitely going to take a big hit. Um, I kind of like to think that no damage can't be undone, but I think it takes a lot longer for that damage to be undone than it does for it to happen. I think even the last 4 years, with the January 6th investigation, with investigations into corruption and crime, that took a 4 year process and it's not even over. And it took, I think, much far less than that to create that kind of damage. I mean, January 6th, for example, was basically one day. And I think it kind of shook the country to its core for years. And it's still something that's kind of being litigated in the public space. So I think you kind of see how that erodes away at these systems. Um, I think it's also taken a lot of Americans to look themselves and look each other in the eye and realize that our checks and balances don't function as well as we would have thought, I think, 10, 20 years ago. And what that means for kind of long-term sustainable democracy. Like, how can we actually reform these systems? I think there's a lot of beliefs that the way that the founding fathers built these systems can't be changed. They're kind of core to the country, and I think actually that's sometimes where a lot of European countries are more mobile. There's much younger constitutions. People aren't as stuck to them. There's the idea that you can always rewrite a constitution if it doesn't work. They're not like hundreds of years of legacy. But I think when Americans see all of these terrible things happening. I think the Supreme Court's a good example. There are currently 9 seats in the Supreme Court. There's been a lot of questioning of whether or not that should be expanded. Many people are like very against that because it's such a long tradition, but there actually have been seats added to the court over the course of years. It just hasn't happened recently. And I think when you think back about it to the 14th Amendment, for example, I mean, we think that that's sacred to the country, but that was something that was added, a little under 200 years ago. It's not something that is core necessarily to American identity. Um, and so I think, there's a lot of damage that can be done. I think the checks and balances are not as strong as people think. I think we're going to see further erosion of those checks and balances, but I don't think that it's something that's unrepairable. But I do think that it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work, a lot of creative thinking, and a lot of convincing people that if they're not working, there's no reason to stick with them as they are. I think another thing that I like to point out is the founding fathers did leave systems to improve government. It's not supposed to be stagnant. It's not supposed to be exactly as it was 250 years ago. That's the whole point of being able to pass laws. That's the whole point of being able to add amendments. And so I think we're going to need to rely on those structures if we're going to come back from this.
Speaking of checks and balances, there doesn't seem to be much faith left, of course, in the Democratic Party in the next 4 years. You mentioned Congress and as well as the Supreme Court that are in the hands of conservatives. Let's just face it, and Republicans. Another group of actors that comes to my mind are the activists. Which role do you think activists will play in the next 4 years?
I think they'll have a very important role. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are feeling fatigue. And so we hadn't seen, the kind of mobilization, for example, after election results were called against Trump. I know there was a rally against his presidency this weekend, but I think if you talk to a lot of people in the United States, they're just kind of feeling a general sense of fatigue at always being the ones to push back, at always being the ones in the streets, regardless if it's a Supreme Court decision or a law by Congress or presidential action. I think there's a lot of exhaustion, and I understand, of course, why. But I think when you don't have those voices, when you don't have those activists in the streets, that's when you, I think, become really concerned about democracy, because when people start to get so battered down that they just kind of don't care about what comes next, don't have the energy to stand up, I think that's extremely concerning. But I do think that as individual really bad policies will happen, we will see that kind of pushback. And I think, we have 50 states, that's 50 states of mobilizing activists. All of them are going to be critically important. And I think there's a lot of good ideas that come out of the resistance. I think you saw that from, 2016 to 2020, even in the voting rights space that I worked in, the very large voting rights package that, I think could kind of revolutionize American elections, that came out of a moment of resistance. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll see other examples of that when it comes to climate and the economy, of these kind of more large and radical solutions that will hopefully appeal to people. And I do think at a time of resistance is the best time that those can kind of surface.
And if you could give an advice to European leaders for the next 4 years, maybe something along the lines of lessons learned from Trump's first administration, and now that you're going into his second, what would be your advice?
It's a very good question. I think the top two that I would have is making sure that there are very good protections, very robust protections for civil servants. I think it's very important that they are able to operate, that, the kind of core functions of government and democracy are able to operate in a way that civil servants who don't really serve a political party are able to do their jobs very effectively and provide resources for the people. I think, that's something that when it's done away with, it causes even more frustration amongst the people that government is not working for them, which already led them, I think, to authoritarianism in the first place. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if there are any, additional barriers or protections that can be built up for civil service, I think that's vital. Similarly for civil society. And then I think it's very important to understand the media ecosystem and the role that social media plays in being able to, really radicalize people, and that people less and less are relying on traditional media formats to go to the polls. And so, I mean, it's an incredible struggle. One thing I've worked on is media literacy, for example. I think that's something that digital literacy, media literacy, a lot of European countries have been promoting. Finland, Estonia really come to mind, especially against Russian propaganda. And that it's this idea, that you can kind of, if you can't get rid of the information, the disinformation, you can at least kind of inoculize the population in order to not fall for it. And I think Europe has done a very good job with some of that stuff, but there's more work to be done. And I think you've also seen some strong, legislation to kind of monitor or regulate social media companies come out of Europe. That's something that the US is also lagging behind on. But, if that's a road that they've gone down on, they've been somewhat successful in doing that. I would really encourage them to keep hammering on that more, because it has, very, very consequential effects on elections and democracy.
Absolutely. And, speaking of social media, I don't think you brought it up, and I don't think I could go on the conversation without mentioning the big push that Donald Trump received from TikTok. Just the day before inauguration, or 2 days before inauguration, TikTok was suspended in the United States. If you would open TikTok on an American phone, you would receive a message pretty much endorsing and thanking Donald Trump. I think it shocked many users. I'm personally not a user, but of course it came up across the other social medias that I use. And then once it was finally restored, this message of appreciation. So TikTok is, of course, a Chinese app. So even an app a social media app that it's not owned by American billionaires, it's bowing to Donald Trump. I don't even know the words to use. What were, I don't know if you used TikTok, but if you did, and if you opened the app and saw the message, like what were your thoughts?
I do use TikTok for better or worse. And I saw the message and it was extremely alarming. And the fact that they would, essentially start operating again before he was even inaugurated, because they knew that they would receive a policy change or something. So, even though the government decision went into effect, they continued to operate because they knew that Donald Trump would pull them out of the hole. But I do think that kind of targeted message is something startling to see. I think, TikTok is one of the sources of disinformation that many people are concerned about, and how that affects people's voting habits, people's impressions of democracy. And to see that come back online and specifically thank him, I think it's also, very hypocritical, because as you might have seen, Donald Trump was the first person to kind of actually start waging war on TikTok and trying to ban it as a point to anger the Chinese, and kind of further escalate tensions. And so what happened under President Biden, that was not a decision or not a series of events that started really unraveling. And so I was actually asking my friends these questions yesterday. I was like, I just don't understand how everything kind of works out for him. I mean, he's the one that tried to ban TikTok, got the ball rolling on us. It finally happened. And yet he's the one that kind of gets to swoop in and save it. And so for a lot of TikTok users who very much value it, for a lot of social media content creators who make their living off of that, I mean, obviously that's going to curry favor with them. And if you don't listen to the traditional media anyway, and you see millions of Americans see this message on their TikTok thinking to President Trump, I mean, obviously that's very political, that's very partisan. And so it was very interesting to see. I mean, I think it'll be a question of whether or not it still gets sold to an American buyer, and if that's the way that it's going to continue to operate. I think that also poses a lot of international questions. I mean, most of the social media companies are American owned, and yet they operate in Europe, and they haven't been banned, even though they've caused a lot of problems. And if that were to happen, I think there would be such an uproar about, uh, company independence and the magics of enterprise, and yet the United States can kind of turn around and ban a foreign-owned company like that, when I think they would be very upset if that started happening to American companies. But yeah, that message was was very startling indeed.
Who for you will be the face of American democracy in 2025?
It's a great question. I think I will look at some of the Supreme Court justices, I think, for some of their dissents. Those tend to be extremely powerful, and kind of give a signal that if the courts were operating in the way that a lot of people would like them to, what some of the outcomes would be. And I think, for better or worse, that provides solace to a lot of people in very difficult times. Same with the, Roe v. Wade decision. I think there are some young people in Congress. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez definitely comes to my mind. Obviously, she's incredibly progressive, but I think as you've seen her journey on Capitol Hill too, she's become just a very smart tack or politician who knows how to operate in a lot of spaces, and on occasion work with conservatives as well to deliver wins for Americans and her home district. She's also, a very young politician, obviously not afraid to say what's on her mind. I think that's a lot of why people also cling to Bernie Sanders, and why he, despite being an independent and being seen as a far right or far left progressive by a lot of people, was able to make a very successful run for candidate for presidency. So don't be stereotypical and throw out the two most progressive people in the United States politics. But I think those will be great. And I think in my mind too, a lot of people who served under President Biden and President Obama's cabinets come into my mind as well. I think Hillary Clinton will continue being a voice of reason to many people, as with Michelle Obama, President Obama, of course. And I think, actually one thing that my think tank has been kind of toying with the idea of is, similarly to UK Parliament, where you have a shadow government sometimes, when the other party's in power, what that could look like for the United States, and to have, if the Justice Department is making a very bad decision, who's going to be kind of the voice of reason for why that's radical or why that shouldn't be that way. And so I do think I think we'll see those voices anyway, but there's, a more concerted effort that could happen there. But I think, past leaders will also be a great voice for democracy in the next 4 years.
I think that's a really nice segue to my last question before I let you go. But how will you not be losing hope during Trump's second mandate?
Very good question. I think it's the saying, but it's always true that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think it's going to be a very hard 4 years. I think also people are concerned that it might not be the last 4 years of his presidency, because he's clearly been willing to, trample other parts of the Constitution. So what's to keep, a two-term presidency sacred? But I think when you look at people's resistance, when you look at people's voices of justice, that's incredibly important. I think no matter what's happening at the federal level, there are small communities who are very supportive of each other, people willing to fight for the rights of people who they've never ever met before, willing to take to the streets to protect those rights. And so I think that is incredibly heartening. And I think it's been a wake up for a lot of people that, American democracy is not that sacred. American exceptionalism is probably not the right way to go about things. But I think when you see communities coming together and people supporting each other across this very big country. I mean, it's 360 million people. It takes days to drive across it. It's practically the size of Europe. But when you see people kind of link arms like that across states, especially even I think again of Roe v. Wade and all the women who rallied and turned out in record numbers to vote, to register to vote, to push back on these policies, even in conservative states. I mean, even in a state like Missouri, for example, here, which is very red, a measure to protect abortion rights it won on the same ballot that President Trump won the state on. So when I think you see flashpoints like that, it really gives me hope, and that people who maybe have not been tuning in or listening to politics as well are going to wake up in these next 4 years. And I think actually something I heard from a Hungarian politician recently is the idea that a lot of people keep saying, like, we need to make the world better for our children or for the next generation. But I agree that there's like something not right about that. We also have this one life to live. We have this one life to prosper, and we can't keep living that life under oppression or under authoritarianism. Like, we're also trying to make the world better for us, not just for future generations to come. And I hope a lot of people will live by that ethos for the next 4 years.
I absolutely loved that final message. I think I'm going to leave it with that, Greta. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for today's show. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and Policy Voices will be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.